Welcome to On the Line. I am your class clown, Samira Moyedin. On today's episode, we have Palestinian American legal scholar and Rutgers University professor Noura Erakat. Now, I spoke with Noura on March 19th. This is exactly one day after Israel reignited officially its murderous marauding inside Gaza. You don't want to miss this. Stay tuned. I want to start with the campuses and the universities in the United States. Unprecedented solidarity for Palestine and Palestinians over the past 17 months, and the clampdowns and the deportations and expulsions, and I'm going to call it abductions of students under this administration. What are your thoughts as you see all of this unfolding?
I would use abductions as well. I think that basically the taking of students off of campus without judicial warrants, as is the case with Mahmoud Khalil, certainly counts as a form of an abduction, an attempt to disappear him by moving him from New Jersey to Louisiana without notice, although we just heard from the Southern District of New York that he will be moved back.
He will? Okay.
His hearing he will be in New Jersey. And then in the other cases of those who aren't legal permanent residents, like Laqa Kurdiya, and the Indian national PhD student and Fulbright scholar who self-deported. I mean, these are...
Yeah, she's here in Canada, actually, Ranjani. She just arrived here, yeah.
And in those cases, government certainly has in these cases the opportunity, for example, to deport somebody who's out of status. But what we have to pay attention to is that what's happening here is a racial profiling and a villainization of pro-Palestinian protesters, and certainly Palestinian, Arab American, and American Muslim protesters, where it heightens the racial profiling, creates a heightened sense of their culpability, and therefore marks them as targets. And so we can see here, on the one hand, the administration can say that it had acted lawfully, for example, in the case of Laqa, F1 status, out of status, didn't attend classes, and so on and so forth. They could say that at the corner of their mouth, but why did they go after her, right? The fact that there might be others who are out of status, who have much more egregious cases, and yet she becomes the priority for the administration is an indication that this is not only going to be an outright repressive governmental campaign, but in the course of it will create a heightened sense of racial profiling that even, one that will inflect across society as people, this becomes this presumption of some sort of culpability, but also for universities that whether they say it out loud or not, right, are going to be hesitant or reticent to admit Arab American, Palestinian American, American Muslim students in order to avoid this altogether. So we are in a moment, that's really zooming really narrowly in. We are in a moment where government repression is full throttle. At the same time, I want to emphasize two things. One is how this is certainly about, shutting down pro-Palestinian speech altogether in a way that, you want to railroad genocide and ensure that this is the legacy of it that's remembered. That's what's at stake, right? The government and Israel have completely failed in the narrative battle, despite their influence on media, despite the fact that you've got, governments that are involved, despite their interventions at the United Nations. They have completely failed at the narrative battle, which has been taken up by masses of people, scholars, civil society, individuals, students. And so now in response to that, if you can't win, then just shut it down. And that's what we're seeing. The other part of this that I want to emphasize is that this is not just about Israel, but this is about an elite within the United States that wants to achieve its own policy goals in the US, long-term policy goals of starving the beast, an a right-wing anti-woke movement that has, targeted universities for being too progressive. Well, how dare you think? How dare you, be visionaries? Things that, have been averse to DEI and critical race theory, but really averse to the United States taking on a history of racism and settler colonialism. And this is a prime opportunity. This is a prime opportunity for those who bear this agenda to railroad it through, right? Using Israel as a Trojan horse because of the way that it could be securitized, and because, they have been framing, it's just so silly to me that they've been framing this as wanting to protect Jewish students. This is the administration that wants to take down CRT, DEI, has fired, right? Anybody who Black woman primarily is taking issue with the Department of Interior, and indigenous, peoples has taken issue with different courses of study. But you really want to believe that they care about protecting Jewish people? I mean, it's just so apparent to anybody, right? And yet what you see is, because of the securitization and because of the criminalization of this enhanced criminalization of trying to equate critique of Israel with anti-Jewish bigotry, that you've just created this trap. You've created this trap, and I think that anyways, I'm getting into a lot of topics, but I think
how do you I guess because I recall, the first thing that I remember is all of the heads of the university sort of being brought in before Congress in this very sort of McCarthy like, what's your response to this? But the universities are not victims in this, right? Those heads of the universities, how do you see them being culpable in their own undoing?
Oh, look, there's a big lesson to draw from here, right?
Yeah.
Which is that compliance will not make you safer. Okay, so let's just start there. That's the big lesson. Compliance will not make you safer. Hiding will not make you safer. These are, being careful, obviously, so that you don't make stupid mistakes and you don't get, tripped up, because they're going to pick us up on anything. They're picking us up without cause. Imagine if there's the slightest cause. So obviously there's a way that we have to be careful. I'm not saying not to do that. But the lesson from the university experience is they threw us under the bus. They were the first line of defense in this. Had even one of those university presidents sat up there and said, these are anti-war protests, full stop. Our students have a right to know where the investments in our endowments are invested. This is responsible investment in the same tradition that the climate change activists took issue with, whether or not we were investing in clean energy, the same way that students have taken issue with whether or not our investments were perpetuating apartheid in South Africa. These are anti-war movements, full stop. So we will not, when they ask, what about your Jewish students on campus? We want to protect all of our students. These protests have been peaceful. All of our students are participating in what's par for the course. Instead, they got up there, accepted that their Jewish students were at risk, threw them under the bus, and if they said anything, they didn't even say, this can't be about targeting Jewish students because Jewish students are actually
participating,
out here. And then the only line that they drew, if they drew a line, was free speech. I might not agree with this, and I abhor this language, and I think it's really bad, but they have a right to say it. That wasn't the line.
No.
That wasn't the line. No. The line was, this is par for the course. These student protests are peaceful. They're disruptive because protests are disruptive because they're challenging power. This is how we handled climate change. This is how we handled anti-apartheid. It is going to be uncomfortable, but our universities do not promise comfort to our students. They promise safety. There is a difference. There is a difference. They threw us under the bus and basically allowed for this narrative to continue building. A narrative where now universities were doing more to protect students over a hypothetical genocide than to protect the students who were protesting an actual genocide. They brought us to this point.
What do you make of that coddling? I mean, I just want to come back to what you brought up there about safety and being uncomfortable. This coddling of people who want to support genocide right now. So they don't want to feel uncomfortable. Like in the city that I'm in right now, Toronto, they want to make protesting illegal in certain areas. And on the questionnaire that they're asking city residents is, do you feel uncomfortable when you see a protest? What do you make of that?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I just, folks, I think that we're really in a situation where, because of an anemic public conversation about everything in the world, about our conditions, about, I live in the United States, okay, Samira? In the United States, you can't really ask people who they voted for. It's seen as something private. Like, that's my private information. Like, you ask for their medical records or something, right? It's not private. It is about you are influencing and shaping our public life and regulating it. And yet the way that we're all going to get along is basically through a framework of tolerance without engagement. Right? Tolerance, that's really what it is. So you can't talk about racism. You can't talk about capitalism. You can't talk about imperialism. You can't talk about, climate change. You can only be out here, respect everybody for what they are, and then and not engage. And it's created an incredibly, I think, inept, mass society. Obviously, we see activists and leaders and organizers who are breaking through this, but in general, there isn't really a language. I want to focus on racism. Let's just focus on racism. So in the United States, and this is a critique of the United States in general, that the United States, dismantles its de jure segregation, regime, de jure racial regime in 1964 through the Civil Rights Act and 1965 through the Voting Rights Act. Okay.
Can you just define de jure?
De jure, as a matter of law.
Don't know. As a matter of law.
As a matter of law. So de jure versus de facto, as a matter of fact and as a matter of law. Okay. So as a matter of law, right, there was a legal reform that dismantled, Jim Crow as a matter of law. But what the United States did not do, right, was continue a process to really engage in a process of decolonization as a settler colony, in which case it would have had to deal, right, with a history of chattel slavery, an institution of slavery that enriched, companies, universities, individuals, institutions in the United States, as well as ongoing settler colonialism that continues to enrich and enhance American settler sovereignty at the expense of indigenous nations. Nobody talked about this. So that's why this wasn't, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act wasn't attended with reparations, redistribution, land back, a reckoning with white supremacy as an illegitimate ideology, right? What we see white nationalists doing in this moment is they want to put white supremacy, white nationalism on par with black power, brown power, and so on. Yeah. The distinction between them is that white nationalism is advocating domination, as opposed to any of these other, groups who have advocated for, some sort of black power and brown power. They're advocating for an end to domination. The parity between those is where we get stuck because of a lack of reckoning with a racial colonial society. And instead, all we get is this de jure, again, legal reform that dismantles, right, racial segregation and discrimination. Now there's no impediments. We won't make you equal. There won't be any, backward looking. We'll just get rid of the impediments that prevent you from competing, right? This lasted 10 years, 10 years and some change before we saw the first, Supreme Court case. It was Bakke versus UC Davis, where an older white medical student candidate is rejected from UC Davis, right? He's rejected from a lot of other schools, but he's only taking issue with UC Davis in California because UC Davis has an affirmative action program that would allow, that does have a quota for minority students. And Baki sues the university to basically say that I was discriminated. This is 76. So we're like this is what, 12, 13 years after the Civil Rights Act, and says, but for that quota, I would have been admitted to UC Davis. Now, he doesn't take issue with the fact that there is ageism working against him, and the university is biased towards younger medical students because of how long they can serve the field. He doesn't take issue with the legacy students or the quota for the students who are children of those who attended UC Davis. He is only taking issue with the quota, right, for minority students who have historically been excluded from the medical profession, who are basically causing a severe shortage of those who are even culturally sensitive, right, to be able to address sickness in their community. The Supreme Court in this moment, and this is a critical moment, the Supreme Court in this moment could have read in the 14th Amendment, which is, the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause in the United States, could have read into it that the purpose of it was to rectify harm caused by racism. But instead what they do is they read the 14th Amendment to basically say that any race-based analysis is racism. And so here we have the judicial advent of color blindness, right? And so racism is no longer now an analysis of power, maldistribution of power and wealth, its concentration, the desire to dominate, none of that. Now racism becomes, do you see race? And if you see race, you are racist. And so we never get over this. And instead, you see, I think we
it's
see
like a hamster wheel that you just keep going around and around, and then new laws are concocted to sort of feed that
in
process.
order to protect that. And then by the time that Obama is elected into office, now we see a deliberate effort in order to foment, these racial antagonisms in order to deflect from the harms of neoliberalism and the impact that they're having on communities who are increasingly impoverished, right? And so, right. So rather than white communities taking issue with hyper neoliberalism and a lack of government regulation, that it ensure them basic goods of housing, quality education, employment, a living wage, some sort of a fair minimum wage, even, right? Now it's much easier to go after the fact, how is there a Black president? And I think that since that moment, the rise of the Tea Party movement, and we have seen since that moment this kind of like reckoning and punishment in response to that, into where we are right now, where we have a full frontal assault. We have a white nationalist movement, right, that wants to basically get what's theirs. We've seen people have talked explicitly. They want to, close the borders. They want to deport people. They want to, get rid of,
DEI, yeah.
Because it's harming a white nation. I mean, this is the language that they're using explicitly. And then to make it very transnational and obvious, now you have Elon Musk, a white South African, who's taking issue with the fact that in South Africa, right, any kind of now movement even to redistribute, South Africa had a similar de jure movement where they really don't dismantle apartheid and decolonize. They just also dismantle the legal regime. So that if you look at any of the indicators, even the number of years, right, that Black people will live is less than that of white people. I mean, South Africa is still in dire conditions based on these racial inequities. But in any case, you have now the Trump administration, which has established that there will be no asylum for anybody from the world, creating an exception for white South Africans.
Yes, I saw that they're going to allow them to come into the country.
Well, they'll allow them to apply for asylum.
Yeah, I mean, that is wild.
Redistribution that's going to be undertaken by the South African government targets them unfairly and so on and so forth. So this is like a transnational, movement that basically says enough. You've done enough. You've pushed enough to dismantle racism. You've pushed enough to challenge patriarchy. You've pushed enough to, go after, capitalism and how much wealth we can accumulate. And so now we see this, I think, one of the most aggressive counter-revolutions, and the first front of that counter-revolution, right, is against those who protested U.S. empire and genocide. I mean, Israel has everything to do with this, not least because of, let me pause here, but I'm just going to say, yes, it has everything to do with Israel, but no, this is not just about Israel.
I remember even I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago in Florida, they said, we're not going to teach slavery anymore. It's making the white children feel uncomfortable. It's not nice. I remember that.
Literally, you have to, I think it's also Florida, where parents have to sign a permission slip to read books by Black authors of a particular type. I mean, what? Wow. What do you mean hurt their feelings? This is history, right? This is how we are learning a history. And that, I think, who is it? I heard a comedian. Oh, what is his name? Anyway, I heard a comedian and he was great. He said, you really can't explain, the U.S. is headed towards like a lot of civil, antagonisms internally, but it's also because the U.S. can't agree on a history.
Right. Yeah.
We can't agree on our own history. I mean, and this is why, the debacle over the 1619 Project, many people say that, history begins in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence. You have Nicole Hannah-Jones and others who want to say, no, let's begin it in 1619 and write this institution of slavery. Others would rightly say that we should begin with a history of settler colonialism. In the United States, I used to teach in the DMV area, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. And so I would assign my students an assignment where they would have to both visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as the Native American Indigenous Museum in Washington, D.C. And just the aesthetic of it and the writing of it, you walk, both of them reveal completely different stories. The Native American Museum is basically a celebration of culture. Oh, look. Tapestry, foods, traditions.
Thanks for sharing.
Religion, da-da-da-da-da. You walk into the Holocaust Museum, it's somber, it's dark, it's like something really bad happened. And so, and even, the language, if you read on the the plaques in the Native American Museum, Native Americans apparently just were disappeared in the United States because of disease and war. Versus the Holocaust Museum, where there was an actual campaign to destroy the Jewish people.
And who the perpetrator is. Yeah.
And we know who the perpetrator is. The United States hasn't even recognized that it committed genocide against an indigenous people, and that genocide and that removal continues. That it's in the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? It's in the Mauna Kea in Hawaii, like the 30-meter telescope. And so we do not want to talk about it. Everybody's just going to be comfortable. Everybody's going to tolerate one another. And somehow we're going to be a cohesive society. This is where we're at.
It's also goes back to this sort of politeness and civility of, you don't ask, don't tell what people voted for, what their politics are.
Which is only one way, right?
Yeah.
It's politeness and civility only one way. Like you have, and I know this as an activist, a student activist, I guess decades ago now. I remember, we launched the first divestment campaign at UC Berkeley on February 6, 2001, which was in the course of what's known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, or the Second Intifada. And February 6 was the day that Ariel Sharon was democratically elected into office a second time, who had been, convicted even by Israelis themselves for the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, his involvement in it, as well as, was known as the Butcher of Beirut, who now is ascending a second time through democratic elections. So we launched divestment at Berkeley when we unfurled banners and Say Their Gate and created a mock checkpoint where, one checkpoint was for Jews only, because however you want to put it, like in Israel, Israel basically transformed Judaism from a faith and even an ethnicity into a juridical national status. And so that's how it's regulated within Israel. Through it, you are afforded housing, land, education, job opportunities that are excluded as a matter of fact from anybody, regardless if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you do not have the same access to those rights, right? It's Jewish nationality through which those rights flow.
So it's Jewish supremacy, and then
I would say Jewish supremacy, Jewish national supremacy. I mean, it's a national status, and we should theorize it as it's a racial theory, right? Of creating basically a form of racial supremacy in this instance. The irony of that, of course, is very blatant. So we had a Jews-only checkpoint and a Palestinian-only checkpoint with, mock theater, or what do you call it? Guerrilla theater?
Guerrilla theater, yeah.
People can see what was happening. This is how we launched. We also took over buildings. We did all the things that the Christians are doing, but at much, much lower risk. We did not, obviously folks got arrested for civil disobedience. We had to do, but we weren't being deported. We also, and I would say, and that's another story, like folks who are at risk should take less risk in general. The point is that at this point that we're doing this work, we're really trying to highlight that this is a form of racial colonial domination in the form of apartheid. And even then, the idea was that folks were not to be comfortable, right? Folks had to just be safe. And there's a difference. Well, during this time, a lot of, Jewish Zionist students complained about us. And the DOE did take up these cases years later and said the same thing that we're saying right now, that comfort shouldn't be guaranteed, right? But I remember just purposefully, right? Because we were at harm's way too. We were getting threatened. Some people were getting attacked. Folks were physically assaulted, right? But we can make the same complaints, the same exact complaints that Jewish Zionist students were making. But as racialized minorities, we can make the same exact complaints and even assert harm and assault and not get the same reaction from the administration. So even when we're talking about civility, let's be clear. It is not flown. It is not a universal civility. It is just a concern when racialized peoples begin to take issue with the status quo and a structure of domination.
How do you explain that? How do you explain the sort of the juxtaposition between whose safety is uplifted and taken seriously and whose isn't? How do these institutions, I guess I just keep wondering how these institutions are going to recover from all of this.
I mean, look, I think the most blatant thing that we should consider is that these institutions are also, they are functioning along a racial framework, whether or not they acknowledge it or not, right? It's this racial framework. It's the same racial framework that denies that Palestinians have a reasonable sense of fear or have a right to life and thus have a right to self-defense, to protect themselves and one another, right? The same way in which our fear is not recognized.
Yeah.
And thus our self-defense, is not even contemplated. Forget how it's regulated in international law and its attachment to territory and land and so on. Just think about, just on a visceral level, that at what point is our victimhood recognized? How is it that we can only be perpetrators but never recognized as victims? And that's a racial framework that's basically written us out as a problem, right? It's the same way when James Baldwin is asked, what can you tell us about the Negro problem? And he responds and he says, we don't have a problem. Black people don't have a problem.
You have the problem.
That's a white problem that you have
That's interesting.
with us. And so in the same way, we're in this condition where we don't have a problem. Our problem actually is well documented and known. It's occupation, it's settler colonialism, it's apartheid, it's genocide, right? We can get rid of these systems and we wouldn't have a problem. What is your problem with us? And this kind of racialization that continues unchecked, it's what Mahmoud Darwish, when he writes in 1982 about the permission to narrate in the aftermath of the invasion of Lebanon, right, that the reason Western media could not recognize Israelis as perpetrators, even in this intense moment, has to do with the fact that they could not imagine Palestinians, right, having a homeland worth defending. It's that inability to understand that we are attached to something, to a land, that we have a history, that we have been on course in fighting for our collective, self-determination and for the liberation of our land. If you don't understand that basic framework, then how else can you understand Palestinian, behavior, political configurations, choices that are made, unless you think that they're just irrational, hateful, violent, Jew-hating people.
Yeah.
Like that's why I keep insisting we're not going to make our way through this if people don't begin to really grapple with and understand the problematic of Zionism as a racial settler colonial ideology, right? And the Palestinian struggle for liberation as a noble struggle, and the Palestinian struggle as one for our freedom, right? You're not going to make it through. We're not going to make it through just getting to the point where, all people just deserve, have to get along and deserve to be okay. No. We have got to understand this fundamental root cause, right? In order to understand that when we fight, we are fighting for a universal norm of liberation. And if we didn't, that would make us less human. That would make us, then you should question our humanity when we are allowing ourselves to be dominated, oppressed, killed, our families separated, our life chances diminished, starved, dispossessed, removed, sexually assaulted, detained without trial. And if we sat on our hands and said, but it's okay, right? That's all right. We're going to take one for the team, because Western civilization has failed to deal with white supremacy and anti-Semitism taken to its logical end in white supremacist logic of annihilation. And that's going to be projected onto us because of that lack of responsibility. Then you should question our humanity. But when we struggle, when we resist, when we teach, when we nurture one another, when we refuse, and when we stand up, that is how you know. That is the test of our humanity. And so here, it's that this is what's missing, Samira. And now we see precisely why universities are going after, the administration is going after, they canceled the Palestine Studies Search at Hunter College. They don't want us to teach this.
Well, they did one here at the University of Toronto too. Yeah.
They don't want to teach it. They're going to go after professors. They're going after books that you teach. They're invading, this is all part of the same effort that they cannot beat us.
It shows a level of desperation too, I feel like.
I think it shows the height of Zionism's weakness. I just think it shows really the end of, Zionism in I would think that its heyday wasn't in 1948 when Israel was established, or 49 when it's accepted as a UN member state, right? I think at that point, really, the UN was dealing with the Jewish question as a refugee question. And for them, what do they do with this massive number of refugees? And so the question of Palestine was transformed in order to create this outcome. Zionism, however, the idea that somehow, this racial settler colonial ideology that Zionists insist is part of, Jewish national liberation, right? That logic really hits its peak in the aftermath of the 1967. These Six-Day War, so to speak, or the 1967 war, where you see Israel defeat numerous Arab armies in a span of 6 days, is seen as this like miraculous, thing that happens.
David and Goliath, yeah.
Here's the David and Goliath.
Yeah.
Here's the besieged, tiny little nation that took on all of these Arab monsters and prevailed without, taking into account, forget it. We're not going to rehearse those details. But that's where you see even, right, Black thinkers in the United States who adopt and embrace Israel, and Zionism in particular as a national liberation model. I want to highlight that that's also where we get a Black radical tradition, as exemplified by Malcolm X, by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, by the Black Panther Party, by a number of others who also begin to understand, wait a minute, Israel, in the words of Malcolm X, Israel basically is an imperial imposition that creates a wedge between the African continent and the Asian continent, right? Understanding this as being now a permanent form of Western intervention that undermines the strength of this, of these peoples and their
the region, yeah.
And the region. So that's kind of like, if you want to say there was a heyday, that was the heyday. Right. This is like the more, this idea that, oh my God, and this is, you also see in this moment, Israelis are besides themselves. They didn't think that they would take so much land. And that's why they decide, they extend into the West Bank and Gaza, and like, we're not leaving. Right. This is miraculous. This is a gift. We're not leaving. This is a gift from God. Right.
And that messianic rhetoric really picks up at that time.
100%.
Yeah.
Now we're like, 58 years from that moment. Right. And Zionism is at its lowest peak. You don't have people talking about it as, Jewish salvation. You don't have people talking about, Jews are not safe anywhere and this is what they need, or this is how we're going to. You really have Israel and its strength completely separated from the question of a kind of, liberation struggle, a Jewish liberation struggle. Those two things are not going hand in hand. Israel and its strength is about military power, exporting military carceral technologies. It's about, developing, logics in warfare that are also exported. It's about alliances with also unsavory regimes, weapons exchanges, technology exchange, right? It's a garrison state. It's more weapons, it's more gates, it's more exclusion. It's the right to a particular kind of national sovereignty, even if that sovereignty is exclusive, supremacist, and violent, right? And so how is that no longer, right? That's why you don't see young, Jewish people flocking to the streets and what becomes, they're fighting for their liberation. They don't see their liberation in that model. They see their liberation as entwined with other racialized communities. They understand that the same harm that white supremacists pose to them, as evidenced by, tiki torch marchers and otherwise, right? That the same harm the risk that they pose to them are posed to Black communities and to Muslim communities and to Palestinian communities.
Well, I think that's what scares them the most right now, these Zionist leaders, is that they have lost the youth. I mean, we can see it through their TikTok bans and everything else, that they're really trying to, as you say, win the narrative again, but it's just slipping.
Well, and all I want to emphasize is, yes, this is the greatest repression that we've seen, but that repression, corresponds to the strength of Zionism as an idea.
Yeah.
Right? They cannot win the narrative battle, so they are going to shut it down.
I want to come to what you were talking about, the media, because when I was speaking with investigative journalist Anthony Lowenstein, he said that overall the Western media just does not like to look at Israel as a perpetrator of crimes against humanity, no matter what it does. And there have been other scholars who have said, there is legal precedence. We saw it in Rwanda. We saw it in even the Nazi genocide, that the media can be held accountable. What mechanisms are there in order to be able to do that?
So I'm just going to say that there could be
Yeah.
a lot of mechanisms. I mean, I think, look, newspapers that are biased, you're not going to hold them to account. You can't. That's within the freedom of speech. They can tell whatever story they want. All media is biased. And in fact, the landscape that we have is that people basically get to choose their own media. Right? So that we're not going to be able to take to account. Now, what we can take to account, right, is certainly defamation. When they have, in that instance, for example, when you hear Jake Tapper and Dana Bash basically go after the Rashida Tlaib's defense of students as being anti-Semitic because of a person in office has Jewish identity, come on. That you can just sue them using a defamation law in the United States. But defamation is, requires deep pockets. It's really complicated. But in terms of what about their complicity in genocide? This fits under the Genocide Convention, that they can also be culpable for the incitement to genocide. Have they incited this genocide? And I think that we could, I remember really early on, before the October 17th attack on the Al Ahli hospital.
Yes.
That was the first hospital. And then it was like thrown into controversy because was it, whose rocket
Who did it? Yeah.
Who did it,
Yeah.
right? Forget that 36 hospitals have been, rendered somewhat unfunctional to completely destroyed.
Yeah.
Forget that we never go back to that, right? But in that moment, the BBC, I remember seeing the BBC headline, and then I had to jump on a interview and then went back. The BBC headline said, "Are there Hamas fighters and weapons hidden beneath Al Ahli?" And I looked at that like, what? What is this narrative? Like, this is such propaganda, BS. Did the interview, came back, Al Ahli was bombed, 500 people were killed. I mean, in that moment, the BBC was priming us, to see the bombing of a hospital and not demand the end of, the cessation of hostilities immediately. And even the language around it, Samira, I mean, even if somebody in that moment could say, oh, but it's the fog of war and we really don't know who shot the rocket. Yeah, but somebody hit a hospital. The civilian cost is too high. This must be stopped. If the fog of war is that distorting, stop the war.
Yeah.
But we couldn't. Because the media refused to either, engage with this rhetoric, or did worse, became a mouthpiece for the Israeli government. Why was I on interviews where if you brought me on as an expert and as somebody who understands the law and I don't represent any government, I'm only representing people, right? That's what a human rights attorney would do. Why are you out there challenging everything I'm saying by telling me Israel would disagree with that? I don't.
Oh my God.
What do you think Israel is going to agree? Would I be here if Israel agreed with my narrative? That's not your job as a journalist. Your job as a journalist is to do your own investigation, to ask me challenging questions that I can, that are maybe set up so that I can respond to them, right? Set up a talking point that you've heard and say, would you respond to this talking point even? But never. It was always the embodiment. I did one BBC interview where the anchor literally, I felt like she might as well have been an agent.
The IDF spokesperson.
Literally.
Yeah.
Everything. She said, but human shields, but da-da-da-da. And I'm like, have you done your homework? Israel has been using the human shields framework very explicitly since its 2006 invasion of Lebanon.
Yeah.
And told us again in 2008 and 2009, told us again in 2012, told us again in 2000, and less so in 2018 in the Gaza March of Return, but certainly in 2021. We have had investigations into all of these episodes, including by the United Nations, investigating the use of their own facilities, and they have never been able to show that these facilities have been transformed into military bases that would then qualify them as human shields within the laws of war. Why are you doing your homework? You have had a decade and some change, almost 2 decades to be doing this research and have failed to do it. I mean, this was, so you're asking me, let me get to the other question. You're asking me about their culpability and whether or not they could be sued. I mean, theoretically, yeah, I could tell you what the legal theory is, and I kind of have. But that's not how lawsuits work. It's really going to depend on the political climate. This war is not going to be, this battle is not going to be won in courts. Courts are political bodies that are going to reflect a consensus that's happening outside. Right?
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow.
And so you're not going to get the court moving far ahead of society. They move behind society. And so this clamp down on protests and the repression is also done in the service of being able to preempt any court from finding, right, against the perpetrators. Now, that's not to say that in the short term they might win in that repression, but I doubt they'll win in the long term, right? These babies who are being orphaned and left, left with only 2 limbs, right, are going to grow up. They've got stories to share, right? And so there is also a future, I think, that we can't even anticipate, that if we fail to deal with this and reckon with it, that it will be reckoned with. You've got a massive number, millions of people who saw this with their own eyes, who are now being told to shut up, who are not speaking because they're afraid of punishment and retribution, not because they believe the narrative, right? And so this is where I think, I wouldn't put too much hope anyway on courts unless we can win politically. And so that's why it's really important to continue to agitate in the ways that we do.
I want to ask you about that imagery. You mentioned the children. I mean, we've seen them shredded, beheaded. And over the past 48 hours in particular, it's been quite abhorrent. What do you think about sharing these images? What do you think about it?
It's really, really tough. I totally, like, on the one hand, I think I have to, like, the least we could do is witness. The least we can do. There is so much pain and suffering. The least we could do is to bear witness and to understand that it's being done in our name, right? On the other hand, the amount of carnage that we've seen, the fact that it just is increasingly more cruel, more gross, more disgusting, is can create this desensitization where, somehow one person being killed on a day with a gunshot, at least, there weren't, a room of premature babies who rotted to death in their beds. I'm really of 2 minds, because I think that we should be able to recognize that this is gruesome without having to see it, and then the effect that it really just does create we just become so used to it. And so how do we protect against that? I think one way that's done, right, is to not pivot to tell, and this is the work of Palestinians in Gaza in an organization called We Are Not Numbers, who are writing their stories. Like, one way to really protect and to prevent that, against that risk, is to engage in the substance and the stories and the lives of those people.
So it's not just images, right?
Not just images, not just numbers, but like, who are they? What did they dream of? Where did they live? These people are imperfect. They're humans, right? Were they jealous? Were they particularly selfish in their relationships, or were they particularly kind? I mean, these nuances. What did they dream of, right? What were those horizons? I think that's a way and we can't, how are you going to do it now with some 48,000 just confirmed dead? That's not even considering the Lancet reports that project, upwards of 400,000. And so that's a high task, but that's also the work of documenting these stories, of reading these stories, of sharing these stories, of platforming Palestinians to speak for themselves, for themselves.
I was talking to Diana Bhutto. I posed this same question to her, and she said that, where she is, and I was talking to her, she was in Ramallah, she said that there is a real genocidal fervor in the country, though, and she thinks that these images are almost like sadism, that a lot of people are enjoying this imagery.
Oh yeah.
And that's why whenever I am also of two minds, where I think, this journalist in Gaza is risking his or her life to show this to the world. The least I can do is share it. And then on the other hand, I don't want to feed into those people who are like,
I'm less concerned about the sadists, to be honest. I'm less concerned about the sadists on this count. I'm more concerned about what happens to a society that becomes too used to these images and then, is primed to accept Palestinian suffering. I mean, it's kind of like the other side of the coin. I was saying this, where, on day 100, President Biden, was recounting all of the Israeli victims of October 7th and didn't mention 10,000 Palestinian children who had been killed. I mean, that kind of occlusion is also what primes people to accept our suffering. And I think that seeing these images has that risk. In terms of the sadists, this is... we really, I really think that people have got to pay more attention. We have all got to pay more attention to the way that, frankly, Israeli society has become has been, especially in this time, incredibly sick, where they are performing TikToks, ridiculing our suffering, right? Where they basically are boasting about how many Palestinian babies to kill and recording themselves, where families are taking parents are taking their children out onto boats in the Mediterranean Sea to watch Gaza be pummeled. So deranged. As part of fireworks. That's sadism. That somehow that's not even like fulfilling another sick piece, where Palestinian suffering means our safety.
Entertainment.
It goes into entertainment. Yeah. But this is even sport. Like I see these things on Channel 12, Israeli Channel 12 or Channel 2, somebody lamenting, I can't sleep properly until I see a Palestinian home bombed. Or, somebody else, I read, every time I get sad about my life, Israeli, every time I get sad about my life, then I think of, Palestinian suffering and I become happy.
Wow.
I mean, that part. And so that's why, there's also this narrative, even amongst our allies, that want us in this very moment to be thinking about, what is the future? How do Israelis and Palestinians live together? And I feel very offended. Like, I was saying similar things, even, in 2019, even through, the beginning of this, where, there's got to be a future where Palestinians can imagine a more optimal future for Jewish Israelis than Israel is able to offer them, right? Because our Palestinian future is a return to the future, not to the past. So in that construction of this future vision, we should be able to build a society that's optimal, that creates safety for all. Now, I think that that's an incredibly offensive question to ask, because there is that conversation is irrelevant without accountability. There is no future to build with anybody in a society, in a genocidal society. That there has to be accountability and reckoning. There has to be ownership that this wasn't legitimate self-defense. That the slaughter of babies in this way, right, it was not okay and is a stain on all of humanity. That failure to have that accountability, wanting to skip over that and just, let's think about now, what do we do?
Reconstruction.
No. I mean, that I think is going to be a major, because very, very few societies, aggrieved societies, have benefited from accountability, right? I can't think of many communities that have, those who have been able to vindicate parts of their story in international tribunals, maybe, right? And really, the best example that we have of some sort of accountability is what happens for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, where to this day they can still sue to get
Well,
their
they're still getting money actually from
get
Germany.
reparations, to get their looted possessions back, right? And I think in that way, that's the lesson we should learn. We shouldn't be, many people want to, model the powerful. They want to be like AIPAC. They want to be like the Zionists. No. Let us not model that. But I would model this form of accountability, because I think that that's what all aggrieved communities deserve and need. And in this instance, there's no future without it. Like, it's why you have and I get it. The tenor of a younger generation is there is no future together. Right? And I get that, especially when there has been no accountability. Who are we expected to live with?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? You're supposed to live with the people who genocided you, or who rooted for it, or it's another sickness. Yeah.
Hell, right? It's just like this, right? Without accountability, that who don't see value in my life and in my family's life, right? There is a statue for Baruch Goldstein, who massacred 29 Palestinians in the Ibrahimi Mosque in 1993 in Hebron. There is a statue in his honor. And I think that we really need, whatever future we build, cannot leapfrog across the most difficult terrain. And in response, people are going to say, but there needs to be accountability, from the Palestinians and the harm caused. Frankly, I don't, there's going to be a way that this conversation is going to be had, that we don't create parity at all. There is parity in human life, as far as I'm concerned. And I say that with my chest out. There is parity in human life. And there is parity in our human suffering. There is parity in our humanity, but there is not parity in the kinds of violence that are being used. There is not parity in a violence that seeks to dominate and a violence that seeks to liberate. Those things cannot be equated, right? And so how do we also envision a way where we could recognize the sanctity, and just pulling on our own traditions, Arab, Muslim, Christian, traditions of finding that sanctity, without being, subsumed into Western frameworks of a universalist humanity that was never universalist to begin with. Maybe we could do it. But we are surely, I think, in this moment, that there has to be, at the very, very, very least, an accountability for genocide by an international community, by media, by the weapons manufacturers that made it possible, by leaders that colluded and facilitated it. It must be named as a genocide. The Palestinians must be recognized as the survivors of genocide, right? There should be a global effort to rebuild Gaza. And I know what I'm saying right now, and what we're seeing sounds like, fantasy, but it's the bare minimum.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samira.
Thanks a lot. So nice to hear my name pronounced properly by somebody, I have to say.